Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. I just got through doing an hour-long private stream with our members and our patrons, so thank you to all of you who joined. And I actually did it on low latency with zero issues, so I think we really do have the network connectivity issues solved, which means more streams, both public and private, definitely coming your way now that we can do that more stable and have good quality to it. So I'm excited about that. In the meantime, though, I'm ready now that we're done with that stream to dive into another reaction video for you guys. We're taking a look at mental floss today. Haven't really seen many of their videos, but I know that U.S. president content is insanely popular here on Vlogging Through History, so thought it was about time to dive into another one. So we're going to take a look at their video, One Misconception About Each U.S. President. In the process of finishing up episode 2 of my podcast on the tragic lives of U.S. presidents. Going to be picking up with the story of James Madison and going through a couple more presidents after that. So kind of focused on presidents right now. So I thought it'd be fun. Link is in the description to the original content. Please go over, give them a like, check out their other content. If you would, let's dive in.
We've all heard the story about George Washington chopping down a cherry tree and then fessing up because he just couldn't bring himself to
Wait. I've never seen this particular art before. It's like little George Washington, but he's got old George Washington's face. What is the deal there? That's kind of creepy.
The tale has been told for centuries to illustrate that our first president always had an unshakable moral compass. If you ask me, hacking a tree to death for no reason seems like a real jerk move, but whatever, maybe he wanted to whittle himself a canoe. The anecdote first showed up in 1806 in the 5th edition of Washington's biography, The Life and Memorable Actions of George Washington by Mason Locke Weems.
So I learned something there. I didn't know that was when the first time that story appeared. So that's 7 years after George Washington's death. He died in 1799.
In the book, 6-year-old George mutilates a cherry tree with his beloved hatchet, though he doesn't cut it down per se. He confesses the crime to his father, crying out, "I can't tell a lie, Pa. You know I can't tell a lie." George's father is so proud of his son for telling the truth that he then says, "Glad am I, George, that you killed my tree, for you have paid me for it 1,000-fold. Such an act of heroism in my son is more worth than 1,000 trees, though blossomed with silver and their fruits of purest gold." You know, the way that every father talks to their 6-year-old son.
Yeah,
Though
really.
Weems credits the story to an old family friend of the Washingtons, there's no evidence to suggest the story ever actually happened. It's also suspicious that Weems failed to mention such a compelling tale in any of his first 4 editions. Plus, he was known to sometimes play it pretty fast and loose with facts about Washington.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Justin Dodd. George Washington definitely wasn't the only U.S. president for whom a healthy dose of fiction gets mixed in with the facts. Today, I'll try to debunk one misconception about each U.S. president, and while I'm at it, probably remind a healthy number of you that Millard Fillmore existed.
Remind you that Millard Fillmore existed. Millard Fillmore, a.k.a. Alec Baldwin, because the most popular picture, and it's become one of our drinking games here on VTH, that every time Millard Fillmore comes up, I mention that he looks like Alec Baldwin.
John Adams was a monarchist. Okay, fine. John Adams did argue that everyone should call George Washington His Majesty the President, or His Highness the President, but that was mainly because he thought the office should have a title that elevated it above the presidents of random clubs and other organizations.
Yeah, that's part of it, because president was not, think about it, president was not a title that was used for the heads of most other nations in the world at that time. So today for us, president has a different meaning than it did for them. He had a very good point with that. And using a title like Excellency or Majesty, remember, the U.S. is trying to establish itself as an equal to the Britons and Spains and Frances and Japans and all these other nations of the world. And so they needed their leader to have that kind of clout. So a lot of people make fun of John Adams for that, but he had a good reason for it. And he was vice president at the time he was arguing for that. A lot of Federalists got labeled as monarchists early on. Alexander Hamilton actually kind of was in favor of an American monarchy. He would have made George Washington president in a minute, or king in a minute if he could have.
And, okay, fine, he was sort of an elitist who favored a strong central government and wasn't keen on majority rule, but that was partially because he was worried America might otherwise be susceptible to anarchy in the vein of the French Revolution. In practice, however, Adams was a Federalist who staunchly believed in a republic. He just wasn't as democratic-minded as Thomas Jefferson. When the two ran against each other for president in 1800, Adams was depicted as a raging monarchist. Jefferson's camp even spread a rumor that Adams wanted his son to marry King George III's daughter so they could start a British-American dynasty.
But they also spread rumors that John Adams was a hermaphrodite. I mean, there was nasty stuff going on in the press during these campaigns on both sides. There was a lot of stuff about Jefferson and his relationship with Sally Hemings and all that stuff that was going in the press too.
Adams lost his bid for re-election that year, and his largely propagandized affinity for the monarchy became part of his legacy. So did the title His Rotundity, which is what people nicknamed Adams when he said he wanted to call the president His Majesty. Thomas Jefferson introduced ice cream to the U.S. At a dinner party in May 1744, Maryland Governor Thomas Bladden served a dessert that one attendee described as containing some fine ice cream. The previous month, Thomas Jefferson had turned 1 year old.
Yep.
So consider that proof that ice cream arrived on these shores before Jefferson could even say ice cream.
Yep, that's
in
right.
1789, in fact, before the White House had even been built, let alone occupied by Jefferson, Abigail Adams commented on a reception put on by First Lady Martha Washington. According to Adams, the company are entertained with ice creams and lemonade. James Madison always wanted a Bill of Rights. The right to peaceably assemble, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, the assurance that you won't have to become an unwilling Airbnb host for soldiers. The Bill of Rights has some bangers.
Yeah.
But when George Mason first proposed the Bill of Rights at the Constitutional Convention, it was unanimously voted down. Even James Madison, the man who would eventually shepherd the U.S. Bill of Rights into law, was initially against it.
So Madison is typically called the father of the Constitution, but he himself was very clear that there were many voices that went into the Constitution. And Madison is going to be one of the prominent players in the early years of the United States. He's in Congress at first, then he becomes Secretary of State later on. But yeah, it was a practical measure, really. I mean, that doesn't mean that James Madison wasn't for the things contained in the Bill of Rights.
Some felt that defining individual rights didn't make sense for a government based on enumerated powers. By definition, the thinking went, any power not granted to the government in the Constitution belonged to the people. Choosing to proactively assert some rights might muddy the waters. When pro-Constitution Federalists agreed to eventually pass a Bill of Rights, Madison wrote that the amendments are a blemish, but noted it was the least offensive form.
But remember, Madison, as the father of the Constitution, that's his baby, right? You know, anything that other people say, well, it's got to have this. Well, you're changing what I like. I think of the scene, how true it is, I don't know. You know, everybody remembers that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, but he was actually part of a committee of 5 people who were tasked with putting that together. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin were part of that as well. And you have that scene where Adams and Franklin are sitting with Jefferson and they're kind of picking apart wording in the Declaration of Independence. And Franklin's making suggestions, and you can tell that Jefferson is kind of irritated by the changes. And he even says, listen, every word was precisely chosen. You know, you're picking apart my baby here, you know. I'm sure he didn't see it, like say it that way. But again, James Madison saying the amendments are a blemish does not necessarily mean he opposed what the amendments were about. It was just people were adding to, and you know, he probably just figured that those things could be enforced in other ways without having to go into the Constitution.
Eventually, either because of ideological evolution, political expediency, or some combination thereof, Madison became a staunch supporter of the Bill of Rights.
Yes.
As he said to Congress in 1789, after the Constitution had gone into effect but before some of the individual states had ratified it, I think we should obtain the confidence of our fellow citizens in proportion as we fortify the rights of the people against the encroachments of the government. James Monroe was the mastermind behind the Monroe Doctrine.
It does have his name.
In his 1823 message to Congress, James Monroe included a section that basically said the U.S. would henceforth stay out of European affairs and European nations would no longer be allowed to try to take over places in the Western Hemisphere. It became known as the Monroe Doctrine and affected foreign policy for decades to come.
Yeah,
Monroe
not
was
just decades, but a good century or more. Well, almost a century. Really, I mean, the first time the U.S. really kind of violates the Monroe Doctrine is going to be right at the turn of the century.
Originally keen on issuing some sort of joint statement with Britain to that effect. It was John Quincy Adams, then Secretary of State, who urged Monroe to go it alone.
John Quincy Adams, which we're going to get to in a minute, but probably one of the most qualified people who's ever been president. This guy held like every office, had incredible education, diplomacy skills, served in many places. It was Monroe's administration that Quincy Adams was a part of. And interesting thing, by the way, today we think of being a governor or being vice president as kind of the stepping stone to the presidency. At that time, Secretary of State was the stepping stone. I mean, Jefferson, Madison, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, John Quincy Adams, I think were all secretaries of state before becoming president.
Adams also wrote most of the actual doctrine. John Quincy Adams died on the Senate floor. John Quincy Adams
First of all,
was
it would have been the
elected
House.
to the House of Representatives after his presidency was over, so he probably wouldn't have been on the Senate floor at all. And he didn't die on the House floor either.
I've never heard that he died on the Senate floor. Yeah, first of all, it makes no sense. He wasn't in the Senate. Very cool, though, that a former president goes back and serves in Congress as a member of the House of Representatives. But yeah, he collapsed on the House floor, but he didn't die there.
He had a stroke there in February 1848, but he was taken to a nearby room where he died a few days later. Andrew Jackson won the War of 1812 at the Battle of
I've never heard that either.
Andrew Jackson was considered a war hero for his victory at New Orleans, but oddly enough, the War of 1812 was, in some ways, already over by the time U.S. forces claimed victory there. The Treaty of Ghent, which established peace between Great Britain and the U.S., was signed on Christmas Eve, 1814. So why did the Battle of New Orleans take place in early 1815? The treaty specified that hostilities wouldn't cease until it was ratified by the governments on both sides of the war.
Not only that, but word wouldn't have reached the armies in New Orleans that soon. We're only talking a couple of weeks.
The British did so quickly, but the United States didn't ratify until February, providing time for the Battle of New Orleans to be fought. Historians debate if Jackson's victory had any influence on the treaty's ratification, but considering it had already been signed, it's safe to say Jackson's victory did not win the war. Martin Van Buren's parents were Dutch immigrants.
In fact, it didn't win the war because the U.S. didn't win the War of 1812. It was a stalemate. I mean, nobody won the War of 1812.
Martin Van Buren and his parents were definitely Dutch. In fact, he was the first U.S. president who wasn't of British descent and the first to speak English as a second language.
I think the only U.S. president to speak English as a second language.
He was born and raised in a close-knit Dutch community in Kinderhook, New York. But his parents were also born in New York, not the Netherlands. According to the National Park Service, Van Buren's family was the fifth generation of descendants of Dutch immigrants. William Henry Harrison.
And yeah, if you look, that whole Hudson River Valley was all very much of Dutch descent. And to this day, you'll see a lot of Dutch names in the Hudson River Valley of New York.
Harrison caught a fatal case of pneumonia at his inauguration. On March 4th, 1841, William Henry Harrison gave a nearly 2-hour-long inauguration address without wearing a coat, a hat, or gloves. Exactly 1 month later, he was dead, supposedly from a case of pneumonia that he caught at the event. But there's no real proof that it was pneumonia or that he caught it at the inauguration. He didn't summon his doctor, Thomas Miller, until March 26th. At that point, he complained of a few days of anxiety and fatigue. Those issues soon gave way to an illness that included a cough, difficulty breathing, and other symptoms of pneumonia. But Harrison suffered much more from gastrointestinal grief that didn't match the pneumonia diagnosis.
Interesting thing, you see several suspicious deaths in Washington in this time period that all may actually be linked to the water supply there. William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, even some family members of some presidents, some other members of the government, that may have been some kind of gastrointestinal thing.
Even Miller admitted this, writing, "The disease was not viewed as a case of pure pneumonia, but as this was the most palpable affection, the term pneumonia afforded a succinct and intelligible answer to the innumerable questions as to the nature of the attack." In 2014, researchers Jane McHugh and Philip Makowiak published a study that presented an alternative diagnosis: enteric fever, aka typhoid fever.
Yep.
According to their theory, Harrison may have contracted the bacterial infection from drinking contaminated water.
Which, again, like I said, may have also killed Zachary Taylor and some others.
The White House got its water from springs that weren't far from a sewage depository. Two future presidents, James Polk and Zachary Taylor,
too, yeah.
fell ill with gastroenteritis while living in the White House, which supports the idea that there could have quite literally been something in the water.
Yeah, Polk died right after he left office. He almost died in office, too. That would have been 3 in the span of 10 years.
When Harrison died, everyone knew John Tyler would become president. The
Acting
Constitution
president.
says that in case of the removal of the president from office or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president. So when William Henry Harrison died, it seems pretty obvious that his VP, John Tyler, would become president. But if you look at that text closely, you'll see that it says the president's powers and duties will devolve on the VP, not necessarily the job title. Some of Harrison's cabinet initially called Tyler Vice President acting as President. John Quincy Adams, among others, felt this was proper, and it went beyond semantics. If the Vice President was only acting as President, perhaps a special election to choose a new president would make sense. Tyler acted quickly, though, taking the oath of office as president and promptly moving into the White House.
So, as with a lot of things in the Constitution, things that we take for granted and we make assumptions that they are a certain way, it's only that way because at some point someone interpreted it that way, acted on that interpretation, and it kind of became generally accepted, or in cases such as this, it was later dealt with legislation or an amendment to clarify. So same thing with like George Washington. He becomes president. A lot of the powers that are associated with the office of president were not spelled out directly, but were things that Washington kind of put in place. A lot of things that the Supreme Court does are things that the Supreme Court kind of started doing, and nobody really challenged it, or if it was challenged, that challenge was thrown out or overcome. And in fact, it was only when an amendment was passed in the Constitution, I think in the 70s, that clarified the presidential line of succession, and that's when you get it goes president, vice president, speaker of the House, president pro tem of the Senate, and then you start going down the cabinet members list. In fact, if Vice President Andrew Johnson had been murdered as he was targeted in 1865, the president pro tem of the Senate, not the Speaker of the House, would have become acting president until there could be a special election that fall to elect a new president to fill out the remaining years of the term.
Establishing a precedent for presidential succession. That precedent saw 7 more VPs take the office before it was officially codified by the 25th Amendment to the Constitution a few years after John F. Kennedy's death. The amendment says, in part, in case of the removal of the president from office or of his death or resignation, the vice president shall become president. Alcohol was banned from the White House during James Polk's presidency.
I've never heard
James
that.
Polk's wife, Sarah, was a devout Presbyterian and a bit of a party pooper. As First Lady, she prohibited card playing, dancing, and hard liquor in the White House. Receptions during Polk's presidency weren't exactly the highlight of the social season. But Sarah Polk didn't ban all booze at the White House. After a dinner party in December 1845, one attendee wrote in her diary about the adult beverages on offer and their colorful presentation, saying, "Pink champagne, gold sherry, green hock, Madeira, the ruby port, and sauterne.
People loved their Madeira back then.
Rainbow around each plate." Zachary Taylor died from arsenic poisoning.
No, in fact, that one, if you are so inclined to such things, there are pictures of Zachary Taylor's bones to be found on the internet, because they actually exhumed him from his grave in Louisville, Kentucky, to test him to see if he was poisoned by arsenic. And in fact, he wasn't. And there are a couple of photos they snapped of his remains that have been uploaded to the internet since then.
Zachary Taylor died on July 9th, 1850, after several days of debilitating cramps, diarrhea, and other related
Typhoid.
issues. His official cause of death was listed as cholera morbus, a gastrointestinal infection. Taylor had washed down a big bowl of cherries with a bunch of milk shortly before falling ill, for some reason, and some have suggested that the acid and dairy combo caused his demise. More likely, something he ate or drank harbored bacteria, as we discussed with William Henry Harrison. But in the early 1990s, author Clara Rising pointed out that Taylor's symptoms sounded suspiciously like arsenic poisoning. The theory proved so compelling that authorities actually exhumed Taylor's body and had it tested for arsenic. The traces they found were hundreds or even thousands of times lower than what you'd need to poison someone to death, in line with the expected arsenic levels found in any human being. Rising didn't dispute the results. As she told the Associated Press in June 1991, "We have the truth, and that's what we were after."
Good for her.
Millard Fillmore was Mormon. During his
Never
first
heard that
year in
either.
office, Millard Fillmore appointed Mormon leader Brigham Young as governor of the Utah Territory, where
Makes
thousands
sense.
of Mormons were already residing. To thank Fillmore, Young named a county Millard and a city Fillmore. Those places still exist today, which has given rise to the notion that Millard Fillmore himself was a member of the Church
Never
of
heard
Jesus
that.
Christ of Latter-day Saints. He wasn't. Based on the available information, scholars generally associate Fillmore with Unitarianism, although to muddy the waters just a bit, it seems that he declined to self-identify as a member of the Unitarian Church on at least one occasion. Okay, maybe we don't all grow up being taught that Millard Fillmore was Mormon, but 21% of Americans in a YouGov poll said they'd never even heard of him, and an additional 53% had no opinion as to his quality as president, so come on, we had to get creative.
So are these the ones that the least number of people have heard of or just don't care about? Interesting. The Harrisons aren't doing so well. McKinley, Rutherford B. Hayes. Basically, with the exception of Warren G. Harding, these are all like 19th century presidents, so that makes sense. People just don't care about history.
53% had no opinion as to his quality as president, so come on, we had to get creative. Franklin Pierce ran over a woman with his carriage. While he was president, Franklin Pierce was supposedly arrested for running over an old woman with his horse or carriage. According to biographer Peter A. Waller, there's no evidence that this ever occurred. As he told Mental Floss, the fact that there are no newspaper stories about the accident
there would
and
be.
it wasn't mentioned in any correspondence convinced me that it probably didn't happen.
Yeah, there would have been something. In fact, I think the only president who ever got in trouble with the law for an associated thing with a carriage was Ulysses S. Grant, who got stopped for speeding in a carriage.
James Buchanan was single his entire life. James Buchanan is the only president.
Technically true if you define single as not married. That doesn't mean he didn't have like love interests, just mean he was never married. But so I would say that one's actually, if we're gonna stick to the letter of the law here, single means not married. So yeah.
President to have never been married. But in 1819, 28-year-old James got engaged to one Anne Caroline Coleman. She ended the engagement that same year, possibly over rumors that her fiancé was unfaithful and or because she thought he might only be marrying her for her money. Buchanan also lived at one point with an Alabama senator named William Rufus King. The two were extremely close, and people have speculated ever since that their relationship was romantic. After King relocated to France in 1844, Buchanan wrote to a friend, "I am now solitary and alone, having no companion in the house with me. I have gone a-wooing to several gentlemen, but have not succeeded with any one of them. I feel that it is not good for man to be alone, and should not be astonished to find myself married to some old maid who can nurse me when I am sick, provide good dinners for me when I am well, and not expect from me any very ardent or romantic affection."
Interesting.
Other scholars have posited that Buchanan might have been asexual, though this is mainly based on a lack of evidence suggesting otherwise. Abraham Lincoln owned enslaved people. In our episode about the Civil War, we covered the oversimplification/misconception that Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. But here's an apparently widespread misconception I wasn't aware of. A lot of people think Abraham Lincoln owned enslaved people.
Never heard
himself.
anybody seriously
so many,
suggest
in fact,
that.
Professor Gerald J. Prokopovich wrote a book called "Did Lincoln Own Slaves and Other Frequently Asked Questions About Abraham Lincoln." There is no evidence that Lincoln owned enslaved people, for the record, but his wife's family, the Todds, assuredly did.
They absolutely did. In fact, several of his wife's brothers died fighting for the Confederacy.
Andrew Johnson was kicked out of office. Andrew Johnson was the first American president to be impeached. Basically, the radical Republicans in Congress weren't happy with Johnson's forgiving attitude toward former Confederate states after the Civil War.
So this goes to just a lack of education among people who don't understand what impeachment means. A lot of people have the idea that impeachment means removed from office. Impeached is basically a good way to think of that as indicted. You know, just because you are indicted for a crime does not mean you're found guilty of that crime. The impeachment is the indictment. Now you have a trial. And he was impeached, as was Bill Clinton, as was Donald Trump twice. None of those impeachments resulted in a conviction. Johnson came the closest. He won out by 1 vote.
In March 1867, they enacted the Tenure of Office Act, which prevented the president from firing certain officials without the Senate's okay.
And that Tenure of Office Act, listen, I am not going to defend Andrew Johnson. He was a horrible president. He's right up there with Woodrow Wilson for me for the worst we've ever had. Johnson may, I think I hate Woodrow Wilson more. That's for personal reasons. Johnson may have been the most destructive president overall, I think. You could argue about that. But his presidency was an absolute disaster, especially for the newly freed slaves. And we are still dealing with the ramifications of his presidency today, as we are with Wilson and many others. That Tenure of Office Act, though, was intentionally passed to provoke Andrew Johnson into a situation where they could impeach him. He was a Democrat who ran on the ticket, on what was called the National Union ticket with Lincoln. Lincoln was all about unity, and he's thinking ahead to the end of the war, and he's trying to bring people together. And the Democrats were primarily the party of the South and the party of slavery and the party that opposed the Civil War. So he's trying to bring them on board by putting a Southern Democrat on the ticket. Nobody thought he'd end up president. So the radical Republicans, the most extreme wing of the Republican Party, hated Johnson from the beginning, and rightfully so. And so they provoked him into that by passing that act.
When Johnson fired an official without the Senate's okay months later, he was impeached. But the Senate acquitted him by a margin of 1 vote, so Johnson got to keep his job. Ulysses S. Grant's name was Ulysses S. Grant.
Again, this is a mixed bag. I'll let him talk about it first, then I'll talk.
Ulysses S. Grant was born Hiram Ulysses Grant.
He was.
But when Ohio Congressman Thomas Hamer submitted his name for a spot at West Point, he wrote Ulysses S. Grant. It's generally agreed that Hamer thought the S stood for Simpson, which was Grant's mother's maiden name and also the middle name of his brother Samuel. Grant reportedly tried to right the wrong, but ended up just rolling with it.
And it's a very common practice at that time, and still to a degree is today, to use the mother's maiden name as a middle name for a son. Very common thing that happened. My grandma's brother was Glenn Chambers Whitaker. His mother's maiden name was Chambers. So pretty common thing that happened. So he goes to West Point. It says Ulysses S. Grant. He was actually born Hiram Ulysses Grant. At a very young age, switched it to Ulysses Hiram Grant. Among other reasons, he didn't like the fact that his initials spelled out hug. So he always went by Ulysses, even though that was his middle name at birth. And so he did go with the U.S. thing was kind of cool when he got to West Point. It was just easier just to roll with it.
In an 1844 letter to Julia Boggs, whom he'd later marry, he wrote, "Find some name beginning with S for me."
He said Julia Boggs. Her name was Julia Dent. So a little mistake there. Her maiden name was Dent, not Boggs.
Julia, you know, I have an S in my name and don't know what it stands for. I would have gone for Serpentine because it sounds kind of cool, but that's just me. Rutherford B. Hayes was a lifelong teetotaler.
Never heard that either.
Unlike the Polks, the Hayeses did fully ban alcohol from the White House. Rutherford's wife Lucy never drank, earning her the nickname Lemonade Lucy. Rutherford was known to imbibe before he became president. The ban, which was his idea, was mostly a way to appeal to prohibitionists.
Yeah, by that point, prohibition's starting to become a thing, and it makes sense. Get the votes, get the support of a group of people, especially if you're not huge into alcohol. I'm actually going to stop right there. We're about halfway through this video. I like to ramble on, and I've gone on for a half hour with this one. So we're actually going to wrap it up right there. I'll come back tomorrow with part 2 of this one, and we'll cover the rest of the president. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. What's another misconception that maybe you've always believed, or you always heard, or other people have heard, that you want to tell everyone, hey, this is not true about one of these presidents we've just talked about? Use the comment section below. And if you want to join us for those future private streams, we played Kahoot today. It was a lot of fun. We only had about 20 people, so it's very quiet, very private, very laid back. Join as a member or as a patron, even at the lowest level, and you'll get access to those future streams. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.